Yeah, I guess today I'll just sort of give you a flavour of what it's like, partly to study here and do a kind of session that is sort of representative of what it's like to study at Essex. And basically, normally, if you were, are you all fairly interested in studying literature at degree level? No? So are you slightly curious then, or just? No? You just had to make a decision. Okay. Well, you'll get a flavour of what it's like anyway, and it can be stored in the back of your mind in the recesses for later. But some of you are presumably, right?
We're student ambassadors.
Oh, you're student ambassadors, sorry. So, are you two interested, hopefully? Yes. So, I'm going to kind of, normally in sort of university, you would have your sessions would be broken up into kind of lectures and seminars, and the lectures would be the big sessions in which a lecturer delivers a talk to a large body of people, might be hundreds of people there. And often there's a lot of talking by the lecturer at the student. And then seminar would be a more informal session like this. Perhaps you'd have a slightly more filled class. You wouldn't have these student ambassadors, but they would be participating. And we'd talk about the text in detail. And usually you kind of deal with a particular text per session. So today I'm going to it's going to be a whistle-stop tour through ideas about the Gothic. And I kind of picked it because I thought it's got a lot of currency at the moment. And if we look at TV and film, there are many representations that have a kind of Gothic core, if you like, or where ideas about the Gothic have been sort of represented or repackaged in a new form. Can any of you think of any particular TV shows at the moment that you think use a particular figure from Gothic writing? Can you think of a particular Gothic figure? No? No, not at all? Not the... if I were to say a particular count who dwells in Transylvania? Count Dracula. There we go. You don't have to be so nervous. So Count Dracula is exactly a kind of key figure. And what is Dracula? What kind of creature is he? A vampire. And don't you think there's a real kind of, a lot of kind of TV at the moment that's obsessed with the vampire? Wouldn't you say?
I don't know.
You don't know? Can you think of anything with, what's her name, Kristen Stewart or Robert Pattinson? Twilight, yeah. That's to do with the vampire. There's another, when I was probably a bit too old for it, but Buffy the Vampire Slayer, yeah, you're smiling, so you're familiar with it. So there are many examples that we can think of from kind of contemporary popular culture. And the vampire seems to be one type of, as it were, Gothic character or figure that has endured into the current day. There's another series which is very popular at the moment, True Blood. I've not seen it, but it gets very good, some people very much like it. And there's Interview with the Vampire. When I was growing up, I remember that film coming out anyway. So we might want to think about what is it about this kind of Gothic, as it were, narrative that has survived into the modern day. Let me make this big. And there are a number of kind of key features that we might look for in Gothic literature in its origins. If we go back to Bram Stoker's Dracula, even if you've not read it, there's an element, obviously, of horror. Something that we may or may not be familiar with as being a feature of the Gothic is the sense that it comes out of romance writing. It comes out of romance literature. And often reflects the kind of themes that you get in a medieval romance. What if I were to say a medieval romance? What would you think of? What might happen in a medieval romance, even if you're not 100% an expert? What would you think? Knights and damsels. Yeah. So we get that element of the kind of questing narrative, and that remains in a sense in the Gothic. We get that element of the questing narrative. The damsel here isn't, as it were, saved by a knight, but is often, as it were, lured away by the equivalent of a dark knight. In the case of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, it's Dracula that's luring these women away. So you've got all of those kinds of elements going on in the Gothic. And the origin of the word Gothic, it derives from, as I've got here, the Germanic tribe known as the Goths. They settled throughout Europe in around the 3rd to about the 5th century. You may or may not know that the Visigoths, which are a branch of the Goth tribe, are largely seen as being responsible for the collapse of the Roman Empire. They were described as barbarians by the Romans. So that's where the term comes from this sort of old medieval tribal association to this sort of Teutonic German group. And it's often applied to particular types of architecture at a certain period. And you also get sometimes a harking back to Gothic architecture, which might be called the Neo-Gothic, right? So this is just to give you a sense of how this word came into being and how it became to be applied to a certain form of literature. So it emerges really, or is often seen as emerging in British literature with Horace Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto. This is often seen by critics as the first, as it were, serious piece of Gothic writing to emerge in English. In fact, its subtitle said it was a Gothic story. And it combined elements of the medieval romance with mystery and superstition. So all of those kind of components make up Walpole's novel, and this becomes a defining feature of the Gothic. And in a commentary on Walpole's novel, another important novelist at the time, Walter Scott, observes that the Gothic is above all the art of exciting surprise and horror. So we have this idea, it excites surprise, it excites horror. And in Scott's view, Gothic literature's appeal lies in, quote, that secret and reserved feeling of love for the marvellous and supernatural which occupies a hidden corner in almost everyone's bosom. Within this kind of development of this writing in the mid-18th century, we also have a kind of cadre of romantic writers like Shelley, Keats, Coleridge, Byron, who were generally lumped together as the Romantics. But at this period of time, they were rejecting ideas that were being forwarded about experience, as it were, as being entirely rational. Are any of you familiar with the term? I'm guessing you might be in the Enlightenment. Yeah? Well, you guys definitely will be. It is often characterised as an age of reason, and it was a time in which a certain kind of thinking about the world was being applied throughout, as it were, the arts and the sciences before the word science even came into being. But there was the idea behind the Enlightenment that man was now a rational being, and that we were going to apply a kind of more scientific or objective method to experience. Now, people like Shelley, Keats, Coleridge, Byron, they're kind of all questioning this adherence to a kind of rational way of seeing things, and they're actually quite interested in romance, hence they also are called romantic writers, but they're interested in departing from kind of realist narratives. So all of that is kind of feeding in, as it were, to the vision of the Gothic. And the Gothic isn't a uniform kind of entity, and that's what, in a minute, I'll get you to look at the extract. But it's not a uniform entity. It doesn't just sort of, it's not simply just about one form of horror or another. The British form is often seen as developing alongside the political turmoil of the French Revolution. It might be seen as having all sorts of subtexts which tell us something about fears fears about the current political state in Britain. Will it go the way of France? Will Britain get rid of the monarchy? Will it be a bloody revolution? Perhaps that could be seen as being going on as a subtext within these sorts of narratives. Perhaps. There are other issues that we might see within all of the Gothic, which, again, I'll save because we'll talk about it in a minute when we look at the passage. There's also the American Gothic. I'm a lecturer in American literature, and the American Gothic, you've got people like Edgar Allan Poe, might also be seen as one of the godfathers or grandfathers of the American Gothic and the American short story, or in fact the short story generally. But you get issues to do with the plantation house, race, which feature in the kind of US or American Gothic, which is slightly distinct from the British version. In Germany, you get a form called the Schauerroman, which is translates as the shudder novel. It emerged a bit later than the British version, and it emerged in the late 18th century and developed out of a tradition of German romantic writing. And the Gothic has inspired film. I mean, it inspired, not only does it inspire, I guess, horror films today or current sort of vampire style or zombie style films. At the time, it also led on to influencing a lot of film noir, which was a kind of style of film where you had a kind of detective. It was around the sort of 1930s. You would get someone like Humphrey Bogart, who might be trying to uncover a sort of filthy crime that had taken place. And you get a lot of off-kilter angles and shots. Things aren't quite right. It plays into a kind of horrific view of the world. There's a lot of horror lighting that can be used. And I just wanted to play you an example of from Nosferatu, which is another name for Dracula. It's a kind of unofficial version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and there is a mention of Nosferatu in the section that you're going to read. So this was inspired directly by Bram Stoker. So I think you get a sense of that anyway. So what I'd like you to do now for the next few minutes is just to read extract 1, and we can talk together as a group just to see what you notice, what you observe. Okay, so what do you observe about, what do you think, well, you tell me, what do you notice about what you've read? Yeah, it's quite. I mean, if we were to think, I mean, I don't know. I haven't really watched Twilight, but from my guess, more modern kind of interpretations of Dracula, often in high schools like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it's quite hygienic, I imagine. But this seems to be quite graphic, doesn't it? It's quite. They're talking about. Well, what are they talking about doing? putting a stake through a car, and what happens to this is to Lucy. Lucy has been the kind of paramour of, or lover of Arthur. She's been this quite pure lady, but she's become one of the undead. She's been bitten, as it were, and they're talking about sort of cleansing her. So what are they actually going to? What's Arthur going to have to do? And what do they do to this undead creature that is taken over Lucy? Hammer the stake through, and what else? Van Helsing afterwards cuts off her head, stuffs it with garlic. It's quite, in a sense, you could argue it's quite gruesome, right? I mean, it's certainly not a kind of, as it were, hygienic kind of scene. But there are other things that we might want to notice. I mean, what else? Was there anything else that struck you on reading it?
Notice a sense of love and relief that the soul could be released, and the underpinning sort of religious beliefs there.
Yeah. So there's definitely a stronger sense of, I'm guessing again with these modern kind of versions, that you don't get that kind of strong sense of God and the devil, which runs through this kind of 19th century text. And what was the other thing? The sense of relief.
Yeah. Love. He's done her a great service as her lover.
Yeah.
Freeing her from this torment that she's been in. Is that right? I haven't actually read Dracula.
Yeah. I mean, that's it. I mean, I think there's a sense that the Arthur has got this incredible. Again, if we think about this in terms of a questing narrative, he's having to mutilate the body of his lover who's been possessed by something else, and it's in a sense, he's asked, "Brave lad," or something, I think Van Helsing says to him. So there's a sense that he's rising to the challenge, and it is a relief because she's restored from this. Well, what happens? She's restored from. What does she become once the stake's gone through her? Well, she becomes
undead to dead.
Yeah, from undead to dead. So but there's at least some, as you see, I guess, a release or a relief, in the sense that she's suddenly sweetness and purity, and and we get all of the kind of the quite typical associations that we get often in Gothic about purity and sexuality, right? So usually the undead are kind of voluptuous. Their lips are very red. If you look at the bottom of page 1, right? The last paragraph, the thing in the coffin writhed, and hideous and blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp teeth white chapped. There's sort of animalistic, but there's a hint of the sort of sexual going on there. And then if you go over to the next page, she's restored. But Lucy, sort of 4th paragraph down, there in the coffin lay no longer the foul thing that we'd so dreaded and grown to hate, that the work of her destruction was yielded as a privilege to the one best entitled to it. But Lucy, as we had seen her in life, with her face of unequalled sweetness and purity. So, I mean, there's often a discussion in literature about the sort of angel whore complex, that a woman can either be this fallen woman or she can be this pure woman. And here it seems to be being played out at a sort of metaphorical, metaphysical, psychologically unreal perhaps narrative, but it is there in this supernatural form. What about another interesting thing to note. So Stoker mentions here she's become Nosferatu, right? As they call it in Eastern Europe. Where has Dracula come from? I mentioned at the beginning. We all know this, don't we? Transylvania. And where is Transylvania? Roughly. The clue is Eastern Europe. The clue is there, yeah. So it's Eastern Europe and perhaps modern day Romania, Bulgaria, that kind of region. And the interesting thing is that this narrative might not seem to be one that's about the other in terms of those from another place. But actually, what's happened is Lucy is one of the undead. Dracula is from Eastern Europe. He's from elsewhere, as it were, the borders of the European empire, or not empire, sorry, the borders of Europe. And he seems to be from elsewhere. Lucy has been caught. What do we know if Lucy isn't killed or isn't staked, sorry, she's already undead. If she isn't staked, what's going to happen? If they don't stop her now, what do vampires do? They bite other people. So, and what happens when you bite other people? They become undead as well. And what would happen if everyone keeps biting everyone? The good word is invasion. In fact, there's a sort of fear about being invaded or colonized by the other, and the other here is the undead. But interestingly enough, underneath this all is this hint of someone from elsewhere as well, someone from the borders of Europe, the fringes. And if we look, there is an actual historical figure that Dracula is based on. He's based on Vlad the Impaler, whose nickname was Dracula. He was part of the Order of the Dragon, and in, I guess, the language that is used in Eastern Europe around there, it's Dracul or something is the word that has the root, I guess, for dragon. But Vlad had an incredibly cruel legacy. He's known as the Impaler because, yes, surprise, surprise, that's what he did to his victims, his enemies. He impaled them. And in a sense, if we think about this seems to be an interesting narrative about someone who's other. He's right on the border of Europe. He's on the border of Christian Europe, on Christendom, and he fought against the Ottoman Empire, who were largely Islamic. Not entirely, but largely. And there's the sense that he's ethnically other, or he's on that borderline, which is, as it were, the borders of Europe. There's something different about him. So this text, although it's not obvious, it may be signalling some fear, as it were, with the other or the foreigner. And it's also got a fear of the alien. Now the word alien, if you look it up in an OED or in a dictionary that lists the etymology or origins of the word, you can find out it was originally used in the 14th century. That's when it first came into English, and it's used to denote another person, place, or family. So you might just describe someone as alien originally as just someone who's from a separate family or a separate area. So someone from Newcastle comes to Essex, oh, they're an alien. But it increasingly these days is used in another context, and it is often used to mean strange or foreign. I mean, if something is beyond this planet, it's alien to this planet, right? But if we were to stick the word illegal alien, sandwich them together, what would that relate to? Who would it relate to? Who's an illegal alien? You guys can answer. Illegal immigrants, right? And what is the big fear at the moment in the press? If you're a Tory or a UKIP, or if if you're a Tory person, you're afraid about the threat of UKIP. What is the threat?
Them taking over. Not taking over, but there being too many of them.
Too many immigrants. From which part of the world, incidentally? You know the answer to this. From Eastern Europe. The big threat of Bulgaria, in fact, which is this part of the world. So it is incredibly prescient, the fact that I picked this topic, I think. So I'm suggesting that underneath these kind of narratives, there are always fears or subtexts, I should say, in fact, before I talk about fears. There are subtexts often about other topics. Now,
is Arthur a coincidence then? The fact that he is Arthur.
Arthur, as in King Arthur. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sort of, I haven't sort of read Stoker's biography, so I don't know what the reason why he picked Arthur. But you know, I wouldn't dismiss that as a important name that signals this kind of medieval, you know, knight of the realm, knight of the or king, in fact, of the Knights of the Round Table. So yeah, I mean, why not? And he is picked as the person who will be the most holy of holy people to do the deed, to put the stake through Lucy, partly because he's her lover. But yeah, I mean, I think the association is certainly there. I was just going to consider another kind of novel, which is kind of, I was just thinking about other examples of the Gothic, and Jane Eyre is another example where, well, there are actually a number of novels that use the Gothic, but don't entirely take us down the route of giving us monsters, as it were. They stick to a realist narrative. And Jane Eyre is a good example that uses elements of the Gothic, but it doesn't entirely take us down the route of there being actual monsters. And there are a number of novels that you may, I don't know if you can think of any that you may have read or fiction that sort of has a Gothic element that's slight. Nathaniel Hawthorne, have any of you read The Scarlet Letter? I'm guessing you may have, but did. But are you an English teacher? Or? Yeah, okay. But but The Scarlet Letter is another example of a kind of novel that has, as it were, slight elements of the Gothic. Now, in Jane Eyre, the main kind of the ghostly presence in this novel is Bertha. She is the first wife of Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is his governess. They basically, a romance develops between them. They kind of fall in love. They're about to get married, and then it turns out actually he's still married to his first wife, who is the madwoman in the attic. And she has been glimpsed by Jane Eyre, but she's always believed that it's some sort of apparition, or that it was her imagination, or she was dreaming it. And there's a moment where she is glimpsed, and this is to show you how, for example, the Gothic can give us a subtext about foreign others, as it were. I never saw a face like it. It was a discoloured face. It was a savage face. I wish I could forget the role of the red eyes and the fearful blackened inflation of the lineaments. Now, what do we know about Bertha? Well, if you read the novel, you'll discover that Bertha married Rochester in Jamaica. She's a Jamaican Creole. Do any of you know what Creole means?
Mixed race.
Well, that's the interesting thing. It's often used to mean mixed race these days. If you refer as well to like Creole food, it often is like mixed in a pot in New Orleans or something. But Creole, when it was first used in the Americas, just meant local to the Americas. So you could be Creole of European descent, you could be Creole of African descent, because it could be used to describe slaves, and it could be used to describe those who are mixed race as well. Now, here, clearly, Charlotte Brontë envisaged Bertha as being of mixed race. She's of some European heritage, but there are these various references that suggest savage, discoloured, a kind of racist kind of thinking. But they suggest that she's partly of African descent. And she's linked explicitly to the German spectre, to the vampire. So there is this link quite clearly with the Gothic. But there are all these sorts of fears, as it were, about what it means for Rochester to be married to this woman who's from the Caribbean, who appears to be, at least in this telling, mixed race. Now, I'll give you just one more example of an extension on from Jane Eyre's novel. Jean Rhys, in 1966, wrote the novel Why Sargasso Sea. And this, if you look in extract 3A, well, we'll look at it in a second. We don't have a huge amount of time. But she basically herself was a Creole of white descent, completely European heritage, or at least in her view, from Dominica, and she wanted to retell Bertha's story in the modern, or in the 20th century. She felt that she'd got a very unfair, as it were, hearing from Charlotte Brontë, and she wanted to basically give her a fairer story. So we get this tale in Wide Sargasso Sea of Bertha, but she renames her Antoinette. She's never called, and she has the name Antonetta as a middle name in the Brontë novel. In Rhys's, Antoinette becomes her kind of Christian name, the name on her birth certificate. Bertha is just the name that the Rochester-like figure, who was never named, gives her. It's a nickname, it's a cruel nickname, and we're deliberately told this. Now, if you look at extract 3A, we have an episode in which we don't have a huge amount of time, but if you can kind of run your eye down it, and I'll probably just sort of take you through it. But the Rochester figure who has married Antoinette has become lost in the forest, and maybe you've just got enough time. If you just read 3A, I'll give you a minute or two, and I'll just round off. So in this section, the I character is this Rochester figure. He's gone wandering into the forest. He's kind of, I'll fill in the details. He's basically, he's formed a kind of unhappy relationship, it seems constantly tortured, with him and Antoinette. And he's kind of metaphorically, as it were, lost. And so what's going on here? He goes into the forest. What did you detect? Who does he encounter in the forest? A young girl. And what does she do? She screams at the sight of him. And then he sort of loses track of time, and then he eventually gets out, doesn't he? And he sees he's a figure, I've forgotten his name now, but Baptiste, that's it, who he knows, who sort of works as one of the servants of the house. We looked for you for a long time. He said, I got lost. And he's asking about this road and this house, and it seems to be deserted. And he says, is there a ghost there, a zombie there? I persisted. And he says, I don't know anything about that, don't know anything about this foolishness. Why do you think the girl might have ran? If there are obviously stories, this is what I would suggest, about this particular uninhabited place in the forest and the road and all the rest of it. Why would she run? Yeah. And why do you think, how visually, if we're thinking about Jamaica, there may be many black people, many mixed race people, he's white. Why do you think that she might mistake him for a ghost? Yeah. So, and the interesting thing is, in a lot of kind of Gothic narratives, there are often question marks around who, as it were, the real monster is. Now here, this isn't a kind of obvious tale of a monster in terms of there is no real monster, but he asks about, was there a zombie there? And there's a question mark. Who is the real zombie? Who is the Walking Dead? Is it Rochester? This is Rhys, who is trying to sort of, as it were, retell Bertha's story from a sympathetic view, and she wasn't sympathetic to Rochester. And to make another analogy, you probably all heard of Frankenstein, right? Right? The Mary Shelley story about Frankenstein. You're all nodding your head, you all know it. What is the name of the monster? It's a trick question. Huh? The actual Frankenstein is he's the guy who makes the monster. However, it's interesting that you say that, because as I said, it is a trick question. A lot of people call the monster Frankenstein, where Frankenstein is the inventor of the monster. and he is just Frankenstein's monster. That's all we can call him. But the interesting thing is that we could say at a subconscious level, or at least one of the questions we're being asked by Mary Shelley, is to consider who the real monster is. Is it the creator? Is Frankenstein, i.e. the scientist, the monster? And in a sense, I'd argue the same sort of thing is being kind of posited here, that Rochester is the real monster who creates or drives Bertha mad. But I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of the dimensions of the Gothic. And as it's 16 minutes past 2, I think we're going to have to draw to a close. So, well, anyway, I hope I've managed to give you a small overview. And yeah, that's me done. Okay.